Marhaba everyone, this is Germcluck TV that you're watching. Today I want to talk about a subject that I've been very enthusiastic about, something that I do want to talk about and have been wanting to for a long time. I haven't had really the time or the energy to put into it, except I do now, especially with the launch of this new Germcluck TV channel, which, as I said before, is going to talk about all the things that I'm interested in: video games, entertainment, movies, onto things like this, which are more based on history. So sit back and relax, we're diving right in to the history and the origin of the Arabs. So to understand the history and the origin of the Arabs, we have to know what an Arab is. Today's definition of an Arab constitutes pretty much anybody who descends from an Arabic-speaking country. These are Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Sudan in the continent of Africa. Then, in West Asia, you have Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine. And then the peninsula, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. Now, these are all the different countries of the Arab world. Many of the people throughout the Arab world look different, sound different, dress different, practice different customs. There's an old joke that a Lebanese man goes on holiday to Saudi Arabia. He stays in a hotel, and he asks the hotel manager, "Why don't you guys have any Arabic food?" And of course the manager replies, "All we have is Arabic food." Now, the humor in this is that to a Lebanese man, Arab food constitutes Eastern Mediterranean food, so you have things like tabbouleh, falafel, shawarma, wararish, which is like grape leaves. So these are all staples of Lebanese diet, which is really similar to Greek food. Egyptians also eat this kind of food as well. But to a Saudi Arab, they don't eat this kind of food. They have different, They have different variations of rice dishes and meat as well. So, Arab culture to one man may be totally different culture to a different Arab, depending on the area. I look at Arabs as a civilization, like a giant empire, and each area of this Arab empire has different customs. This is normal. Even if you go to a country like Iran, which is larger than most Arab countries, but compared to the entire Arab world, significantly small. But even if you go to Iran, you have all kinds of different ethnic groups, like Persians, you have Arabs in the southwest, you have Azeris, who are a Turkic people, similar to Turks from Turkey. So that's just in one country, Iran. Now imagine over the span of multiple countries, this is the Arab world. Also, the dialect of Arabic changes depending on where you are. Lebanese Arabic, which is, most of my family descends from Lebanon. So Lebanese Arabic is indeed Arabic, but it has many loan words from the ancient Canaanite dialects as well as Aramaic. It's a substantial influence on the Lebanese language. Same with Syrian Arabic. So Lebanese Arabic and Syrian Arabic are almost identical. Then Jordanian and Palestinian Arabic are very similar, but slightly different because they're more southern Levantine dialect. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, a Lebanese person can understand a Palestinian perfectly fine. You're just going to have different pronunciations. The Lebanese omit a lot of vowels, whereas a harder, more traditional Arabic dialect, maybe in the East Bank of Jordan, would for sure have those vowels. Now, again, different countries have different dialects within them. So in Syria, you have people on the coast that speak a dialect that's very similar to Lebanese, but in the eastern part of Syria, they would sound more like an Iraqi. Anyway, these are all the Arabs of today. So let's get into the origin. The origin of the Arabs is a fascinating one. It's shrouded in a lot of mythology and folklore, all of which, honestly, is not true. So there is this myth, kind of this mythos, that Yemen is the fountainhead of all of the Arabs. This has been around for centuries. People always believed the Arabs came from Yemen originally, settled into Arabia, and then spread further north into what is called the Bilad al-Sham, so the Levant, then into Egypt and North Africa. This is not true. There's also another theory, which is mainly the Western idea of what an Arab is. So Westerners tend to think that Arabs originated with Islam, and so when the Prophet Muhammad came from Al-Hijaz in Saudi Arabia, he came up, and the four rightly guided caliphs who went on to conquer and establish the Rashidun Caliphate and then the Umayyads, they Arabized completely the whole area. So there were no Arabs anywhere else except for Arabia, and then they Arabized everything else. This is not true either. The truth is that Arabia was named after the Arabs. So the Arabian Peninsula was named after the Arabs, not the other way around. Arabs are not named after people from the Arabian Peninsula. So Saudi Arabia constitutes the vast majority of the Arabian Peninsula. It's called Saudi Arabia. The peninsula is called the Arabian Peninsula. Most people think, okay, this is where the Arabs are from. And many Arabs think this is where they're from too. But in reality, the original Arabs came from the southern Levant. They came from a stretch of land stretching from the Egyptian Sinai through to the Jordanian desert, through parts of southern Iraq, almost to Kuwait. So northern Arabia plus parts of the southern Levant. This is the original heartland of the Arabs. The first ever Arab in all of history was known as Gindibu, and he came from an area in Syria. And this man was notated as having existed, so they wrote about him in 850 or so BC. He could have existed even earlier than that. So this is 850 years before Christianity, which means it's well over 1,500 years before Islam. And there were already Arabs existing. Now, they existed throughout the whole region. They existed in the Jordanian desert primarily. Then they spread into other areas of the Levant. Now you might be thinking, does that mean that there's a secret history and all the Aramaic and Greek and Hebrew speaking peoples of the Middle East, that's just some kind of falsity? No. Arabs existed in the area, that doesn't mean they were the supreme majority. That's one thing you have to understand. Just because some ethnic group exists and they're not the majority language doesn't mean they don't exist. That doesn't mean they have to be the majority. They were a minority in Palestine, or in an ancient Israelite kingdoms, Judea, Palestine, the whole area. The eastern Jordanian desert, and so on. So even though there might have been people speaking Arabic in Syria and in Palestine and even in Egypt, it doesn't mean they were the majority. The Romans actually called Egypt Arabia Aegyptus, meaning Egyptian Arabia. They called areas of northern Syria and the northern Iraq on the border of Turkey Arabia. So many areas have been called Arabia before. The peninsula is actually the last place to have been called Arabia. So, if the peninsula is one of the last places to be called Arabia, what were they doing before? If Arabic came from the north, from the Jordanian area, what were the Saudis and other people speaking? And again, I use Saudis here because that's who the people are today, but obviously at this point in time they wouldn't be calling themselves Saudis, they would just be calling themselves Arabs from wherever. Or actually they weren't Arabs yet. So that's an interesting question. The Tamudic language, which was in central Saudi Arabia today, so Central Arabia. So the Arabians were not Arabs at the start. They were speaking Semitic languages. These are Afro-Asiatic languages. Then you Afro-Asiatic, Semitic, and then Arabic, Hebrew, Canaanite, Aramaic, all the other ones. So they were speaking Semitic languages. They probably had a similar culture to begin with, but they were not calling themselves Arabs. What happened is the original Arabs in that stretch from the Sinai all the way to Iraq, they came down and slowly started to Arabize the peninsula itself. These were different people before they were Arabized. They became Arabized. Then, centuries later, when Islam was founded, these conquerors came out of Arabia and they reinforced and fully settled the Arabic language and dialect in areas that it was already being spoken. So Arabic was already being spoken in the Levant, not as a majority, but they made it a majority. Then they did the same in North Africa, especially in Egypt. So why did the people from North Africa, including Egypt and Sudan, all of the Levant and Iraq, and even the peninsula, why did they become Arabs when Islam spread? When Persia and Turkey, well, it wasn't Turkey yet, but Persia and Anatolia and all these other areas that were conquered did not become Arabs. Well, one interesting way to think about it is that the original Hamitic-speaking Berber populations of Northwest Africa, the kind of Coptic-speaking Egyptians, as well as the Aramaic, Canaanite, and other language-speaking peoples of the Levant were already speaking Semitic languages. So Arabic is kind of like the final seal of the languages. That's why it was so easy for people in the Levant in North Africa to become Arabs and to take on this identity, because, at least in my line of thinking, Arab, like I said, is a civilization. So they're keeping their own indigenous and local customs, but they're joining the Arab Empire. And they're becoming Arabs because this language is easy to understand. The customs are easy to understand. Things like taking your shoes off before you enter a house, ritually cleansing yourself, wiping the grime and the oil and the sweat from your face. These are all ancient Semitic customs that existed before Christianity, before Islam, before the region was even monotheistic. So these people were already similar. Even though the people in Arabia were not Arabs yet, they were Semitic. So they became Arabs. It wasn't difficult for them. Same with Aramaic and Canaanite speaking peoples in Bilad al-Sham. So this is who an Arab is. Like I said, I'm here to dispel some of the falsities of the world that have been spread. Arabs do not come from Yemen originally. Arabs do not come from Arabia originally. They come from the southern Levant and northern Arabia, and they Arabized the rest of the areas over time. That is exactly how the Arabs came to be as an origin, as a people, a civilization, a language, and a custom and a culture. This is where the Arabs come from. Now many people say, what about Bedouins? What about Bedouin culture? Well, Bedouins have existed for thousands of years. They existed before Islam, they existed before Christianity. In fact, there's many Bedouins who are not even that religious at all. In the book I'm reading called Ibn Saud, about the founder of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, it says in there that a lot of the Bedouins were converted to an austere form of Islam, and even then it wasn't fully complete, because the Bedouins were not as religious as people pretend them to be. There's a stereotype that Muslim and Arab and Bedouin are all the same thing. It was actually the people in the settled cities who were always more religious than the Bedouins living in the desert. Now, the original Arabs were a mix of Bedouins, so nomadic people living in the desert, who were guided by the stars. Impressive amount of geographical and distance knowledge. As well as traveling merchants. You had Arab traders coming into Palestine, setting up ports to trade. They were coming over to what is Kuwait now. They were trading there. They went into the Phoenician Canaanite areas as well, mixed with the people, learned their language, spread their language, and traded, of course. So the original Arabs were a mix of merchants and a mix of Bedouins, and there were some who were Bedouin, some who were merchant. It's a completely different way of life. An Arab doesn't mean you have to be a Bedouin. 99.9% of the Arabs today, who call themselves Arabs, do not practice a Bedouin lifestyle. The average Egyptian does not live in a tent in the middle of the desert. The average Lebanese doesn't have a desert in the next 50 miles near them. The average Syrian does not live in a tent in the desert. This is an ancient custom, an ancient culture, all by itself. It is a culture within the Arab civilization. So one nugget of the grand scheme of the entire Arab meal is the Bedouin culture. You also have many other cultures, and you can find Bedouins in Jordan, Syria, throughout most of the peninsula, and even the southern Arabia as well, like Yemen and Oman. So, this is the origin of the Arabs today. And like I said, today what constitutes an Arab is anybody who comes from an Arabic-speaking country. But I think also some people want to diminish what an Arab is by saying it's only a linguistic thing. So you're only an Arab because of your language. I disagree, because these people were already similar to each other before Arabic spread. That's why it was so easy for them to switch from their already Hamitic or Semitic languages and join an Arabic language and an Arabic custom and an Arabic culture, because they were already united in a similarity. People from the East, meaning the Middle East, were more similar to each other for all of history than any of them were similar to the Greeks and the Romans and the Roman Empire. So even at the time before monotheism, even at the time before Arabs had spread at all, you had Hannibal of Carthage, and the Carthaginians, despite not being Arabs, were definitely Eastern. They saw themselves as a continuation of a mix of the Canaanite/Phoenician culture that came from Lebanon, which are the people who actually colonized modern-day Tunisia, and then of course the native Carthaginian culture as well. And that's how I like to view the Arabs as well, as a civilization including many different groups who are sons of the East and of North Africa. Hey, thank you for listening, everyone, to my Germ Cluck TV rant on the history and the origins and foundation of the Arabs as a people. I'll do some follow-up stuff. If you want any questions in the comment section, I'll do my best to understand them. Not understand, I mean to contemplate them and give you a proper answer. I will link some of the information that I used to justify my points, and I'll put that in the comment section or in the links underneath the video. Please subscribe and like the video as well. Leave a comment if you're interested, and I'll be doing a lot more history stuff in the future as well. Germ Cluck out.